Listen carefully, World Bank. We just hit 5.5% growth without Western aid, and I'm watching your development model collapse in real time. You said we'd become a failed state after expelling France. You predicted economic death after I nationalized your mines. You forecasted isolation after quitting ECOWAS. Every prediction failed. Ghana, your perfect student, just crashed, needing IMF bailouts. Côte d'Ivoire, France's favorite, barely grew 3%. Meanwhile, I'm here, stockpiling gold, building with China, and growing faster than your aid-dependent puppets. Your 65 years extraction scheme just died. I killed it. Let me tell you exactly how Burkina Faso achieved 5.5% economic growth despite every Western prediction of collapse. Western institutions immediately issued forecasts predicting Burkina Faso would experience economic catastrophe. World Bank analysts warned our economy would contract. IMF economists forecasted a fiscal crisis. French government officials predicted complete state failure. European Union development experts declared Burkina Faso faced a humanitarian disaster. American think tanks published reports claiming our policies would trigger economic collapse worse than any crisis Burkina Faso experienced historically. Every Western institution with supposed expertise on African development predicted total failure, and every single prediction proved completely false. The specific predictions Western institutions made reveal how thoroughly they misunderstood what drives economic growth in Africa and how completely their development model served Western interests rather than African prosperity. World Bank's 2023 Burkina Faso Economic Update predicted our economy would grow only 1.8% in 2023 and warned growth could turn negative if security situation deteriorated further. That prediction assumed Burkina Faso's economy depended fundamentally on Western aid, Western investment, and Western trade relationships, and therefore policies challenging Western interests would necessarily cause economic contraction. World Bank could not conceive that African countries might grow faster by prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval, because World Bank's entire institutional purpose is maintaining African dependence on Western-controlled development financing. IMF predictions were even more pessimistic than World Bank assessments. IMF's April 2023 Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa warned that Burkina Faso faced severe fiscal pressures from security spending increases, revenue losses from disrupted economic activity in conflict-affected regions, and reduced external financing as Western donors cut aid in response to military government. IMF projected Burkina Faso's budget deficit would exceed 8% of GDP by 2024, forcing either draconian spending cuts harming essential services or inflation-generating monetary financing, destroying currency stability. IMF assumed Burkina Faso could not possibly finance increased security spending without Western budget support, revealing IMF's fundamental belief that African sovereignty requires Western permission backed by Western financing. French government predictions went beyond economic forecasts to explicit warnings of state failure and humanitarian catastrophe. French Foreign Ministry issued statements in late 2022 and early 2023 warning that Burkina Faso would experience complete collapse of government authority, massive refugee flows destabilizing entire Sahel region, and humanitarian crisis requiring international intervention if we continued policies challenging French interests. French officials specifically predicted that expelling French forces would enable jihad, takeover of major cities including Ouagadougou, destruction of remaining economic infrastructure, and famine affecting millions of Burkinabe citizens. Those French predictions served obvious political purpose, attempting to intimidate Burkina Faso into reversing anti-French policies by forecasting catastrophic consequences if we continued pursuing sovereignty. Listen carefully to why all those Western predictions assumed economic collapse was inevitable. Western institutions believed Burkina Faso's economy depended on three pillars that our policies supposedly destroyed: Western aid providing budget support and development financing, Western mining investment driving industrial sector growth, and Western security partnerships enabling economic activity by protecting against insurgent threats. If we expelled French forces, nationalized Western mines, and rejected Western aid conditionality, then all three pillars would collapse simultaneously, causing total economic catastrophe. That logic made perfect sense from Western perspective, assuming African economies cannot function without Western involvement, but that assumption was always false because it ignored African capacity to build alternative partnerships and prioritize sectors serving national interests rather than Western preferences. The prediction that expelling French forces would trigger security catastrophe, ending economic activity, revealed Western arrogance, assuming African countries cannot provide their own security. French officials claimed French military presence was essential for Burkina Faso's security and therefore essential for economic stability. They warned that without French forces, jihadist groups would overrun remaining government-controlled territories, making all economic activity impossible. French predictions completely ignored possibility that Burkinabe forces equipped with better weapons from alternative partners and freed from French operational restrictions might achieve superior security results compared to French forces that presided over continuous security deterioration for years. French could not imagine African military succeeding where French forces failed because French colonial mentality assumed African inferiority, requiring permanent French supervision. The prediction that nationalizing Western mines would destroy investor confidence and halt production demonstrated Western inability to conceive that African state-owned companies might operate mining sector as efficiently as Western corporations. Western mining industry analysts warned in 2024 that SOPAMIB would lack technical capabilities to maintain production at nationalized mines, would mismanage operations through corruption and incompetence, and would fail to attract financing for necessary capital investments. Those warnings assumed African state-owned mining companies were inherently inferior to Western private sector operators, despite evidence from countries like Botswana, where state-owned diamond company operated highly successfully. For decades, Western predictions revealed racist assumptions about African capabilities rather than objective economic analysis. The prediction that withdrawing from ECOWAS would cause trade collapse and economic isolation ignored reality that ECOWAS trade protocols never worked effectively, and Nigerian-dominated organizations served external interests rather than facilitating genuine African cooperation. Western development experts warned that losing ECOWAS membership would cost Burkina Faso access to regional markets representing over 300 million consumers, would trigger trade barriers preventing Burkinabe exports from reaching traditional destinations, and would isolate Burkina Faso economically, forcing increased dependence on limited domestic market insufficient to support economic growth. Those warnings assumed ECOWAS membership provided real trade benefits that withdrawal would forfeit when reality was. ECOWAS protocols existed mostly on paper, while actual trade faced numerous barriers ECOWAS never eliminated. Western experts never understood ECOWAS dysfunction because they viewed African regional organizations through idealized lenses rather than observing actual operational failures. Burkina Faso's economy grew 4.9% in 2024, according to World Bank data, far exceeding World Bank's own predictions and demonstrating complete failure of Western forecasts. Multiple sources project 5.5% growth for 2025, with some estimates reaching 5.8% or higher. That growth occurred while we implemented every policy Western institutions warned would cause collapse. We expelled French forces, we nationalized Western mining assets, we withdrew from ECOWAS, we rejected Western aid conditionality, and we built alternative partnerships with Russia and China that Western powers opposed. Our economy grew faster implementing sovereignty-focused policies than it grew under previous governments following Western development prescriptions, proving Western model never served African prosperity. The primary driver of Burkina Faso's strong economic growth was gold sector expansion that Western analysts claimed would collapse after nationalizations. Gold production increased from 57 tons in 2023 to approximately 60 tons in 2024, despite Western predictions that SOPAMIB would mismanage nationalized mines. Gold exports exceeded $8 billion in 2024 to 2025 period, representing over 80% of total export revenues and providing foreign exchange earnings, supporting broader economic activity. Record high global gold prices throughout 2024 and 2025 multiplied benefits of increased production volumes, and those high gold prices resulted partly from global de-dollarization trends and monetary uncertainty that African gold accumulation strategies contributed to generating. Burkina Faso benefited economically from same global trends that threatened Western financial dominance. SOPAMIB's successful operation of nationalized Bangu and Wagnian mines disproved Western claims about African state-owned company incompetence. Production at both mines remained stable after nationalization in August 2024, with no disruption to operations despite change in ownership from British corporation to Burkinabe state company. SOPAMIB hired experienced Burkinabe mining engineers and managers who possessed technical skills comparable to foreign experts previously operating mines. SOPAMIB implemented improved safety protocols, reducing accident rates below levels recorded under previous foreign ownership. SOPAMIB increased local employment by prioritizing Burkinabe workers rather than importing expensive foreign specialists for positions. Burkinabe professionals could fill competently. Every operational metric demonstrated African state-owned company could match or exceed Western corporate performance, destroying racist assumptions underlying Western predictions of collapse. The opening of Burkina Faso's first gold refinery in 2024 added value to gold production by processing ore domestically rather than exporting to Swiss refineries. Previously, Burkina Faso exported raw gold ore or partially processed concentrates, receiving prices below refined gold market rates with refining margins captured by foreign processors. Our national refinery enabled selling refined gold at full market prices, retaining entire value chain within Burkina Faso. Refinery also employed hundreds of Burkinabe workers in high-skill technical positions, developing national expertise in gold processing that previously existed only in limited foreign operations. Every aspect of refinery operations serves sovereignty and economic development simultaneously, demonstrating policies prioritizing national control over resources generate better outcomes than export-oriented strategies serving subsistence. 17.9. Foreign processors. Agricultural sector growth contributed substantially to overall economic performance despite security challenges in some rural regions. Cotton production, Burkina Faso's second-largest export after gold, increased in 2024 as improved security in key growing regions enabled farmers to return to fields and expanded planted acreage. Government agricultural support programs prioritized food security by providing improved seeds, fertilizers, and technical assistance to small farmers, producing staple crops for domestic consumption. Agricultural growth reduced food import dependence and improved rural household incomes, supporting broader economic activity across regions where agriculture dominates livelihoods. That agricultural success occurred despite Western predictions that security problems would prevent farming and trigger food crisis requiring international humanitarian assistance. Infrastructure development accelerated throughout 2024 and 2025 as government prioritized roads, electricity, water systems, and telecommunications networks essential for economic activity. Chinese companies financed and constructed major infrastructure projects including roads connecting mining regions to ports, solar power installations expanding electricity access, and fiber optic networks improving telecommunications. Those Chinese infrastructure investments filled gap Western donors previously occupied, but Chinese financing came without political conditions. Western aid imposed, and Chinese projects focused on economically productive infrastructure rather than symbolic social programs. Western donors preferred infrastructure improvements enhanced productivity across all economic sectors, demonstrating that development financing serves growth better when it prioritizes sovereignty over conditionality. Listen carefully to what Burkina Faso's 5.5% growth proves about Western development model. Western institutions claimed African countries needed their aid, their investment, their trade preferences, and their policy advice to achieve economic growth. They warned that challenging Western interests would cause economic disaster. They predicted that sovereignty-focused policies would fail catastrophically. Every claim proved false. We grew faster without Western aid than with it. We developed more rapidly prioritizing sovereignty than when following Western prescriptions. We built alternative partnerships delivering better results than subordinate relationships with Western powers. Western development model was always designed to serve Western interests rather than African prosperity, and our growth without Western involvement exposes that reality permanently. The fiscal performance of Burkina Faso's government exceeded IMF predictions about unsustainable deficits. Government revenues increased substantially in 2024 through higher royalties from nationalized gold mines, increased taxation on gold exports, and improved collection efficiency, reducing revenue leakage through corruption. Gold sector revenue growth enabled government to finance increased security spending without generating deficits IMF warned were inevitable. Budget deficit remained below 5% of GDP in 2024, well within sustainable levels, despite IMF predictions that security spending would push deficit above 8%, forcing either spending cuts, inflation-generating monetary financing. Government fiscal discipline combined with revenue growth from sovereign resource control demonstrated African countries can finance their priorities without Western budget support if they retain control over national wealth. The inflation rate in Burkina Faso remained negative in 2025, according to IMF estimates, meaning deflation rather than inflation, despite monetary financing concerns Western institutions raised. Food prices declined as agricultural production increased and government import policies ensured adequate supply. Energy prices stabilized as electricity generation expanded. Overall price stability contradicted Western warnings that monetary independence and reduced Western financial involvement would trigger inflation, destroying currency stability. CFA franc membership still constrained monetary policy, preventing independent currency management, but even within those constraints, Burkina Faso demonstrated fiscal and monetary stability superior to Western predictions. Future transition to independent gold-backed currency will provide even greater monetary sovereignty while maintaining stability through gold convertibility. Western predictions of Burkina Faso's economic collapse failed completely because they rested on three false assumptions that revealed how Western development models served Western interests rather than understanding actual drivers of African economic growth. First false assumption was that African economies depend fundamentally on Western aid and investment, such that policies challenging Western interests necessarily cause economic contraction. Second false assumption was that Western corporations operate more efficiently than African state-owned companies, making foreign ownership essential for productive sectors. Third false assumption was that Western security partnerships protect economic activity, making Western military presence prerequisite for stability enabling growth. All three assumptions were always false, but Western institutions could not recognize their falsity because doing so would undermine ideological foundations justifying Western control over African development. The assumption that African economies depend on Western aid for growth ignored historical evidence that aid often harmed economic development by creating dependency, enabling corruption, imposing inappropriate policies, and substituting for domestic resource mobilization. Multiple economic studies demonstrated negative or zero correlation between aid volumes and growth rates across African countries over decades. Some fastest-growing African economies received minimal aid, while some largest aid recipients experienced stagnant or declining growth. Yet Western development institutions continued assuming aid was essential for African growth because aid dependence served Western interests by maintaining leverage over African policies and providing markets for Western goods through trade. Aid requiring aid recipients to purchase from donor countries. Burkina Faso's growth acceleration after rejecting Western aid conditionality proved aid was never essential for development. Western aid to Burkina Faso peaked under previous governments that implemented World Bank structural adjustment programs, accepted IMF lending conditions, and maintained close cooperation with Western donors. Yet those previous governments presided over deteriorating security, limited economic growth, and increasing poverty despite billions of dollars in Western development assistance. Our government rejected Western aid conditionality, expelled Western military forces, and nationalized Western corporate assets and achieved higher growth rates than Western-backed previous governments ever accomplished. That comparison demonstrates conclusively that Western aid served Western interests rather than Burkinabe development. The mechanisms through which Western aid harmed African development were well documented, but systematically ignored by Western institutions benefiting from aid system. Aid inflows appreciated recipient country exchange rates, making exports less competitive and imports cheaper, hurting domestic industries while benefiting Western exporters whose goods became more affordable in aid-receiving countries. Aid enabled recipient governments to avoid politically difficult taxation of wealthy elites, reducing accountability of governments to citizens while maintaining dependence on foreign donors. Aid came with policy conditionality requiring recipient countries to implement structural adjustment programs, privatize state enterprises, liberalize trade, and deregulate financial sectors, all policies serving Western corporate interests rather than recipient country development needs. Aid created opportunities for corruption as politicians and officials captured aid flows for personal enrichment, reducing aid effectiveness while discrediting government institutions. Burkina Faso's development strategy without Western aid eliminated all those harmful mechanisms. We mobilized domestic resources through taxation of gold production we nationalized rather than depending on foreign aid inflows. We maintained government accountability to Burkinabe citizens rather than Western donors by financing government from domestic revenues. We rejected structural adjustment conditionality, implementing policies serving our sovereignty rather than Western preferences. We reduced corruption opportunities by eliminating aid flows that previously provided resources politicians could divert. Every aspect of aid-independent development strategy served Burkinabe interests better than previous aid-dependent approach, explaining why growth accelerated after rejecting Western aid. The second false assumption underlying Western predictions was that Western corporations operate mining sector more efficiently than African state-owned companies, making foreign ownership essential for productive growth. That assumption rested on ideological commitment to privatization and free markets rather than empirical evidence about relative efficiency of different ownership structures. Multiple examples worldwide demonstrated state-owned companies could operate as efficiently or more efficiently than private corporations when properly managed, including Botswana's Debswana Diamond Company, Norway's Statoil Oil Company, and Singapore's Temasek Holdings Investment Company. Yet Western institutions insisted African state-owned companies were inherently inferior, requiring privatization to foreign corporations regardless of evidence. SOPAMIB's successful operation of nationalized gold mines proved African state-owned companies can match Western corporate efficiency. Production levels remained stable after nationalization. Operating costs stayed within industry norms. Safety records improved compared to previous foreign ownership. Employment of Burkinabe nationals increased, enhancing local economic benefits. Revenues flowed to Burkinabe treasury rather than foreign shareholders. Every performance metric demonstrated state ownership served development objectives better than foreign private ownership that extracted profits offshore while minimizing local benefits beyond minimal royalty payments and employment. The ideological commitment to privatization underlying Western predictions ignored fundamental reality that natural resource extraction creates enormous economic rents that accrue either to foreign shareholders or national treasuries, depending on ownership structure. Foreign-owned mines pay minimal royalties and taxes while maximizing profits exported to foreign shareholders. State-owned mines capture entire surplus, benefiting national treasury that can invest revenues in development. For resource-rich countries, state ownership of extractive industries typically generates superior development outcomes compared to foreign private ownership, yet Western institutions systematically recommended privatization because it served Western corporate interests rather than African development. The third false assumption was that Western security partnerships protect economic activity, making Western military presence prerequisite for stability enabling growth. That assumption ignored evidence that Western military presence often worsens security by alienating local populations, conducting operations that harm civilians, and pursuing objectives serving Western counterterrorism interests rather than African stability. French military operations in Sahel correlated with security deterioration rather than improvement across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. American military presence in Somalia and other African countries failed to achieve lasting security improvements despite years of operations and billions of dollars invested. Yet Western officials continued claiming African countries needed Western security partnerships because Western military dominance served Western geopolitical interests unrelated to African security needs. Burkina Faso's security improvements after expelling French forces and building Russian partnership proved Western security presence was obstacle rather than prerequisite for stability. Insurgent territorial control declined from over 35% in late 2022 under French military presence to less than 10% by early 2025 under Russian partnership. Displaced population decreased from over 2 million to approximately 500,000 as people returned to homes in areas where security improved. Economic activity resumed in northern regions as improved security enabled agriculture, commerce, and mining. Although security improvements occurred after expelling French forces and implementing policies Western institutions warned would cause catastrophic security collapse. The comparison between Burkina Faso's growth under sovereignty-focused policies and economic performance of African countries still following Western development model reveals how thoroughly Western approach serves Western interests rather than African prosperity. Countries maintaining close relationships with Western institutions, accepting Western aid conditionality, hosting Western military bases, and welcoming Western mining investment achieve lower growth rates, experience higher poverty rates, and suffer greater economic instability than countries prioritizing sovereignty. Even when those sovereignty-focused countries face security challenges, Western institutions claim undermine development. Ghana provides perfect example of Western development model failure. Ghana maintained exemplary relationships with Western institutions throughout past decade. Ghana accepted IMF programs and implemented structural adjustment policies Western economists recommended. Ghana welcomed Western aid and investment. Ghana hosted Western military training facilities and participated in Western security partnerships. Ghana allowed Western mining corporations to dominate gold sector. Yet Ghana's economy contracted in 2024 and required bailout from IMF after fiscal crisis and currency collapse. Ghana's debt burden exceeded 70% of GDP, forcing austerity measures harming ordinary Ghanaians. Ghana's poverty rate remained high despite decades following Western development prescriptions. Every metric demonstrated Western model failed Ghana, yet Western institutions blamed Ghanaian governance rather than admitting their model was flawed. Listen carefully to why Ghana failed while Burkina Faso succeeded despite implementing opposite policies. Ghana allowed Western mining corporations to dominate gold sector, paying minimal royalties and exporting gold without domestic processing, exactly what Burkina Faso ended through nationalization and refinery construction. Ghana accepted Western aid with conditionality requiring trade liberalization, privatization, and financial deregulation, exactly what Burkina Faso rejected to pursue sovereignty-focused policies. Ghana maintained close security cooperation with Western partners, while insurgent threats remained minimal, yet Ghana experienced economic crisis, while Burkina Faso, facing substantial security challenges, achieved strong growth. The comparison demonstrates conclusively that Western development model serves extraction of African wealth rather than African prosperity. Côte d'Ivoire represents second example of Western model producing mediocre results despite supposed ideal conditions. Côte d'Ivoire maintained close relationships with France throughout history, including hosting French military bases, using CFA franc without questioning French control, and granting French corporations preferential access to Ivorian resources. Côte d'Ivoire implemented Western-approved economic policies including privatization, trade liberalization, and welcoming foreign investment. Côte d'Ivoire experienced relative political stability after resolution of civil conflict in 2011. Yet Côte d'Ivoire's growth averaged only 5% annually between 2020 and 2024, comparable to Burkina Faso's 5.5%, despite Côte d'Ivoire's supposedly superior conditions, including no significant insurgency, continued Western support, and larger economy with better infrastructure. If Western model worked as advertised, Côte d'Ivoire should dramatically outperform Burkina Faso, yet performance is comparable, suggesting Western model provides minimal benefits. Senegal provides third comparative example showing Western model's limitations. Senegal maintained longest continuous democratic governance in West Africa. Senegal hosted major American military facilities and participated extensively in Western security partnerships. Senegal received substantial Western aid and investment. Senegal welcomed Western mining and energy corporations to develop natural resources. Yet Senegal's growth averaged only 4.5% annually through 2024, below Burkina Faso's 5.5%, despite Senegal's supposedly advantageous political stability and strong Western support. Senegal's recent presidential election in March 2024 brought to power government explicitly promising to renegotiate foreign contracts and reduce dependence on Western partners, suggesting even Senegalese citizens recognized Western model's inadequacy after decades of disappointing results. The pattern across these comparisons reveals systematic failure of Western development model to deliver prosperity despite ideal conditions where all Western recommendations were implemented. Countries following Western prescriptions achieved moderate growth at best while experiencing vulnerability to economic crises, accumulating unsustainable debt burdens, and failing to reduce poverty substantially despite decades of Western involvement. Meanwhile, countries prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval, including Burkina Faso, Mali, and increasingly others, achieved comparable or superior growth rates while building independence from Western control, positioning them for sustainable long-term development serving national interests. The contrast between Rwanda's performance and Western model failures provides additional evidence about effective development strategies. Rwanda achieved consistently high growth rates, averaging over 7% annually through past 2 decades, despite receiving relatively limited Western aid, maintaining contentious relationships with Western governments over governance issues, and implementing policies prioritizing Rwandan sovereignty over Western preferences. Rwanda limited foreign ownership in strategic sectors. Rwanda maintained strong state involvement in economy through state-owned enterprises. Rwanda prioritized domestic resource mobilization over aid dependence. Rwanda's success demonstrated African countries can achieve rapid growth by prioritizing governance effectiveness and sovereignty over Western approval, yet Western institutions criticize Rwandan model because it challenges Western control over African development. Ethiopia's recent experience provides final comparative example demonstrating benefits of sovereignty-focused development. Ethiopia achieved Africa's fastest growth rates, averaging near double-digit percentages annually from 2010 through 2020, while implementing state-led development model, prioritizing sovereignty over Western prescriptions. Ethiopia limited foreign involvement in key sectors, including telecommunications and banking. Ethiopia maintained large state-owned enterprises driving industrial development. Ethiopia prioritized infrastructure investment financed largely through Chinese partnerships rather than Western aid. Ethiopia's growth model directly contradicted Western recommendations yet delivered superior results until Tigray conflict disrupted development, creating opportunity for Western pressure. Even during conflict period, Ethiopia maintained moderate growth, demonstrating resilience of sovereignty-focused model. Burkina Faso's 5.5% growth, despite implementing every policy Western institutions warned would cause collapse, represents permanent death of Western development model's credibility across Africa. That model claimed African countries needed Western aid, Western investment, Western policy advice, and Western security partnerships to achieve economic growth and development. It insisted policies challenging Western interests would necessarily cause economic disaster. It predicted countries prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval would fail catastrophically. Burkina Faso proved every claim false, and that proof cannot be erased regardless of what Western institutions say, attempting to explain away their failed predictions. The permanent damage to Western development model's credibility extends far beyond Burkina Faso's specific case. African governments across continent observed Western predictions about our supposed inevitable collapse. They watched us implement sovereignty-focused policies Western institutions warned against. They saw us achieve strong growth, exceeding performance of countries following Western prescriptions. They recognized Western models served Western interests, rather than African prosperity. That recognition is spreading continent-wide, as more African governments question whether continued acceptance of Western development advice serves national interests when alternatives clearly work better. The specific mechanisms through which Western development models served Western interests rather than African prosperity are now exposed permanently. Western aid maintained African dependence on Western institutions while providing markets for Western exports through tied aid mechanisms. Western investment prioritized extractive industries that exported African resources with minimal local value addition. Western policy conditionality forced African countries to privatize state enterprises, liberalize trade, and deregulate finance, all policies benefiting Western corporations accessing African markets and resources. Western security partnerships protected Western geopolitical interests while often worsening African security situations through operations alienating local populations. Every component of Western model served extraction of African wealth rather than African development. Burkina Faso's alternative development model, prioritizing sovereignty, demonstrates superior approach. We mobilize domestic resources through taxation of national resources we control rather than depending on foreign aid. We capture resource rents through state ownership rather than allowing foreign corporations to export profits. We implement policies serving national development priorities rather than accepting Western conditionality. We build security partnerships with powers willing to support our sovereignty rather than pursuing Western geopolitical objectives. We finance infrastructure through partnerships respecting sovereignty rather than accepting tied aid serving donor interests. Every element of our model prioritizes Burkinabe prosperity over external convenience, explaining why it works better than Western approach. The domestic resource mobilization strategy we implemented represents fundamental break from aid-dependent development model Western institutions promoted for decades. Previously, Burkina Faso's government budget depended substantially on foreign aid, providing over 20% of total revenues in some years under previous administrations. That aid dependence gave Western donors enormous leverage over our policies because threatening aid cuts could trigger fiscal crisis, forcing government to accept Western demands. We eliminated that leverage by building tax system capturing revenues from economic activities within Burkina Faso, particularly gold mining sector that previously paid minimal taxes while exporting billions of dollars worth of gold annually. Our new mining code, adopted in July 2024, increased royalty rates on gold production from under 5% to 7% of production value. That increase generated hundreds of millions of dollars in additional annual revenue flowing to Burkina Treasury rather than foreign mining corporation profits. We also increased government equity stakes in all mining projects to minimum 15%, giving us direct ownership share in production revenues beyond royalty payments. We required mining companies to sell portion of gold production directly to government at below market rates, enabling us to accumulate gold reserves while generating revenue from subsequent sales at full market prices. Every revenue enhancement measure captured wealth previously extracted by foreign corporations, transforming it into domestic resources, financing national development. The nationalization of 5 major gold mining assets transferred even larger revenue streams from foreign shareholders to Burkina government. SOPAMIB now captures 100% of profits from Bango, Wagnian, and 3 other nationalized operations, rather than receiving only royalty payments and minority equity shares. Those profits total hundreds of millions of dollars annually, far exceeding any foreign aid we previously received from Western donors. The revenue transformation is permanent rather than dependent on continued Western generosity or political alignment with Western preferences. We control our own resources, generating our own revenues, financing our own development, independent of Western institutions that previously leveraged aid dependence to control our policies. The capture of resource rents through state ownership rather than foreign corporate extraction represents second pillar of our sovereignty-focused development model. Natural resource extraction generates enormous economic rents, the difference between production costs and market prices for resources. For gold, those rents are massive because production costs average under $1,000 per ounce, while market prices exceeded $2,000 throughout 2024 and 2025. Under foreign ownership model, Western institutions promoted, those rents flowed to foreign shareholders as profits exported from Burkina Faso. Under state ownership model we implemented, those rents flow to Burkina Treasury as revenues invested in national development. The magnitude of rent capture through nationalization is staggering. Bango and Wagnian mines together produce approximately 4 tons of gold annually, worth over $250 million at current prices. Production costs total approximately $120 million, leaving approximately $130 million in economic rents. Under previous foreign ownership, that $130 million flowed mostly to Endeavour Mining shareholders in London, with Burkina Faso receiving only royalty payments of approximately $12 million, less than 10% of total rents. Under SOPAMIB ownership, entire $130 million in rents accrues to Burkina government after covering operational costs. We increased government revenue from those 2 mines alone by over $100 million annually through nationalization, equivalent to substantial foreign aid program, except revenues are permanent and unconditional rather than temporary and contingent on Western approval. Listen carefully, World Bank, IMF, and every Western institution that predicted our collapse. Your development model is dead across Africa. Your predictions proved completely false. Your policy advice served your interests rather than our development. Your aid created dependency rather than enabling growth. Your investment extracted resources rather than building prosperity. Your security partnerships worsened situations rather than protecting stability. African countries are learning all those lessons from Burkina Faso's success, and your influence over African development is ending permanently, regardless of how much money you offer or how many threats you make. The alternative development model spreading from Burkina Faso across Africa combines several key elements that directly challenge Western approach. First element is resource sovereignty through nationalization or increased taxation, capturing resource rents for national benefit rather than foreign shareholders. Mali nationalized mining assets following exactly the precedent we established, demonstrating our model works across multiple countries rather than representing isolated case Western institutions could dismiss as anomaly. Mali's government seized Morila gold mine from Barrick Gold in 2023 after disputes over taxation and environmental compliance. Mali subsequently nationalized additional assets from Canadian and Australian mining companies operating in Malian territory. Mali's nationalizations generated similar revenue increases to what Burkina Faso achieved, proving resource sovereignty serves development across different national contexts. Niger increased taxation on uranium and oil exports dramatically after military government took power in July 2023. Niger previously granted French nuclear company Orano extremely favorable terms, extracting Nigerian uranium at prices far below market rates, enabling France to power its nuclear reactors cheaply while Niger received minimal revenues, despite possessing some of the world's largest uranium reserves. Niger's new government demanded renegotiation of uranium contracts, increasing Nigerian revenue share substantially. Niger also increased taxation on oil exports after ExxonMobil began production from Nigerian fields in 2024. Those revenue increases enabled Niger to finance development priorities independently of Western aid that France and European Union cut in response to military coup. Guinea renegotiated mining contracts demanding higher government shares after military government took power in September 2021. Guinea possesses world's largest bauxite reserves and substantial iron ore deposits that foreign mining corporations exploited under extremely favorable terms previous Guinean governments granted. Guinea's military government reviewed all existing mining agreements and demanded renegotiations, increasing government royalty rates, equity stakes, and local content requirements. Guinea explicitly cited Burkina Faso's mining code as model for proposed reforms. Western mining companies operating in Guinea protested renegotiation demands, claiming contract sanctity, but Guinea proceeded with reforms, demonstrating sovereignty supersedes foreign corporate convenience when national interests require policy changes. Multiple countries followed Burkina Faso's precedent, demonstrating resource sovereignty serves development better than foreign extraction model Western institutions promoted. Tanzania increased mining taxation substantially in 2017, forcing renegotiation of contracts with Barrick Gold and other Western companies. Zambia raised copper mining royalties multiple times between 2019 and 2024, despite Western investor protests. Democratic Republic of Congo revised mining code in 2018, increasing government equity stakes and royalty rates on cobalt and copper production. Zimbabwe nationalized diamond mining operations from foreign companies. Every country implementing resource sovereignty faced Western criticism and investor threats, yet all achieved revenue increases funding development priorities independently of foreign aid, proving model works across diverse African contexts. Second element is domestic resource mobilization, replacing foreign aid as primary development financing source. Countries building tax systems, capturing wealth generated within economies rather than depending on external assistance develop stronger state capacity, greater government accountability, and more sustainable financing. Burkina Faso demonstrated domestic mobilization works when combined with resource sovereignty, capturing revenues previously exported by foreign corporations. Other countries are implementing similar strategies, recognizing aid dependence served Western interests rather than African development. The mechanisms through which domestic resource mobilization strengthens state capacity operate through several channels. First, taxation requires building administrative systems to assess, collect, and enforce revenue obligations, developing bureaucratic capabilities that aid-dependent governments never acquire because aid arrives automatically without requiring domestic collection efforts. Second, taxation creates accountability relationships between governments and citizens who demand services justifying tax payments, whereas aid-funded governments remain accountable primarily to foreign donors rather than domestic taxpayers. Third, taxation generates predictable, sustainable revenue streams, enabling long-term planning, whereas aid flows fluctuate based on donor priorities and political conditions, creating fiscal uncertainty, preventing effective planning. Burkina Faso's experience proves domestic mobilization delivers all those state-building benefits. Our revenue administration improved dramatically as we built systems to tax gold mining sector effectively. Our government accountability increased as citizens demanded services funded by domestic revenues rather than accepting whatever foreign donors chose to finance. Our fiscal planning stabilized as predictable mining revenues replaced volatile aid flows. Every aspect of state capacity strengthened through transition from aid dependence to domestic resource mobilization, explaining why our government functions more effectively now than under previous administrations, despite facing greater security challenges and receiving less foreign aid. Third element is alternative partnerships with non-Western powers willing to provide financing, investment, and technology without political conditionality Western institutions imposed. Chinese infrastructure financing built roads, railways, power plants, and telecommunications networks across Africa without requiring structural adjustment policies, democratic governance reforms, or human rights compliance Western donors demanded. Russian security cooperation provided weapons and training without operational restrictions Western partners imposed. Turkish trade and investment offered market access without preferential terms favoring donor exports. Every alternative partnership demonstrated cooperation was possible without subordination, encouraging African countries to diversify relationships away from exclusive Western dependence. The Chinese infrastructure financing model represents a fundamental alternative to Western aid approach. Chinese loans finance productive infrastructure, including roads connecting mines to ports, railways moving agricultural products to markets, power plants providing electricity for industrial development, and telecommunications networks enabling modern commerce. Chinese financing comes without policy conditionality, requiring structural adjustment, privatization, or governance reforms that Western loans demanded. Chinese projects employ Chinese construction companies, bringing expertise and efficiency that accelerate completion, whereas Western aid often hired expensive Western consultants generating reports rather than building actual infrastructure. Chinese financing requires repayment, creating debt obligations, but infrastructure built with Chinese loans generates economic activity, enabling debt service unlike social programs Western aid funded. Burkina Faso's partnership with Chinese infrastructure companies delivered roads, solar power installations, telecommunications networks, and other productive investments that Western donors never prioritized. Chinese companies completed projects rapidly and cost-effectively compared to Western contractors that charged excessive fees and experienced endless delays. Chinese financing came without demands that we implement democratic reforms, respect human rights in ways Western donors defined, or accept Western policy advice regarding economic management. Chinese partnership respected our sovereignty while delivering infrastructure serving our development priorities, proving cooperation possible without subordination to foreign political agendas. Russian security cooperation provided alternative to Western military partnerships that imposed operational restrictions, preventing effective counterinsurgency operations. Western security assistance came with requirements that African forces comply with international humanitarian law, as Western countries interpreted it, avoid civilian casualties even when insurgents operated from civilian areas, obtain approval for operations against targets Western intelligence identified, and accept monitoring by Western advisors ensuring compliance with restrictions. Those requirements prevented African forces from conducting operations necessary to defeat insurgent groups that Western restrictions enabled to operate with impunity, exploiting rules that constrained only government forces. Russian military partnership eliminated all operational restrictions, enabling Burkinabe forces to conduct effective counterinsurgency operations. Russian advisors focused on combat effectiveness rather than compliance with Western-defined rules. Russian weapons came without usage restrictions or monitoring requirements. Russian intelligence sharing provided actionable information without caveats preventing immediate operations. Russian training emphasized defeating enemies rather than avoiding international criticism. That results-oriented approach explained why security situation improved dramatically under Russian partnership after deteriorating continuously under Western security cooperation that prioritized political correctness over operational effectiveness. Turkish economic partnership provided trade and investment opportunities without preferential terms favoring Turkish exports or requiring Burkinabe policy changes serving Turkish interests. Turkey purchased Burkinabe agricultural products, invested in Burkinabe manufacturing, and provided commercial financing for Burkinabe businesses. Turkish partnership operated on purely commercial terms, respecting Burkinabe sovereignty rather than leveraging trade relationships to extract political concessions. Turkish approach demonstrated international economic cooperation possible without neo-colonial subordination that characterized Western economic relationships with Africa. Fourth element is state-led development, prioritizing strategic sectors through state-owned enterprises, industrial policy, and selective protection rather than accepting neoliberal policies Western institutions recommended. State ownership of natural resources, telecommunications, energy, and financial sectors enables governments to direct development toward national priorities rather than foreign shareholder profits. Industrial policy supporting manufacturing development creates employment and value addition beyond commodity exports. Selective protection allows infant industries to develop before facing international competition. East Asian development demonstrated state-led approaches work effectively, yet Western institutions recommended opposite policies for Africa because state-led development reduced Western corporate access to African markets. SOPAMIB represents state-owned enterprise model, enabling Burkinabe government to direct mining sector toward national development priorities. SOPAMIB prioritizes employment of Burkinabe nationals rather than minimizing labor costs through automation or imported workers. SOPAMIB invests mining profits in exploration, discovering new deposits rather than distributing dividends to foreign shareholders. SOPAMIB processes gold domestically in our national refinery rather than exporting ore to Swiss refineries that capture processing margins. SOPAMIB coordinates with government industrial policy, supporting manufacturing development through reliable electricity supply and infrastructure investments. SOPAMIB coordinates with government industrial policy, supporting manufacturing development through reliable electricity supply and infrastructure investments. Every SOPAMIB decision serves national development rather than shareholder returns, proving state ownership delivers superior development outcomes compared to foreign private ownership that Western institutions promoted. Fifth element is regional integration among countries with aligned sovereignty interests rather than within Western-designed frameworks serving external influence. Alliance of Sahel states built functional cooperation among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, sharing commitment to sovereignty. East African community countries discussing deeper integration benefit from excluding members opposing sovereignty-focused policies. Southern African countries coordinating outside SAD structures dominated by South Africa achieve more effective cooperation. Regional integration works when built on genuine shared interests rather than imposed by external powers, using regional organizations to maintain influence. AES demonstrates how sovereignty-focused regional integration operates more effectively than Western-designed frameworks. We coordinate security operations across borders without requiring Western approval or participation. We harmonize mining codes, ensuring consistent taxation, preventing companies from exploiting regulatory differences. We integrate infrastructure connecting our economies directly rather than routing through former colonial metropoles. We develop common positions on international issues rather than allowing external powers to divide us through bilateral relationships. Every aspect of AES cooperation serves member state sovereignty rather than facilitating external influence that characterized ECOWAS operations dominated by Nigeria and France. The spread of sovereignty-focused development model faces opposition from Western institutions losing influence over African policies. Western governments threaten aid cuts and sanctions against countries nationalizing Western corporate assets. International arbitration tribunals issue awards demanding compensation for nationalizations. Western media publishes reports criticizing African governments implementing sovereignty-focused policies. Western-funded NGOs lobby against resource nationalism and state-led development. Western financial institutions refuse lending to countries rejecting policy conditionality. All those Western responses aim to prevent spread of alternative development model threatening Western control over African economies. Yet all Western opposition proves ineffective because African countries recognize sovereignty-focused model delivers superior results. Aid cuts mean nothing to countries mobilizing domestic resources that exceed aid flows they previously received. Burkina Faso's mining revenues increased by hundreds of millions of dollars annually through nationalization and taxation, far exceeding any aid Western donors might cut in retaliation. Sanctions fail when alternative trade partners exist willing to purchase African commodities and sell manufactured goods without participating in Western sanctions regimes. China, Russia, Turkey, India, and Gulf states provide markets and suppliers independent of Western trade networks, enabling African countries to withstand Western economic pressure. Arbitration awards are unenforceable if countries refuse payment and hold minimal assets in Western jurisdictions vulnerable to seizure. Burkina Faso rejected ICSID tribunal authority over nationalization disputes and holds gold reserves physically in Ouagadougou rather than deposits in Western banks that arbitration awards might access. Western mining companies obtained awards worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but those awards cannot touch any significant Burkinabe assets because we structured our financial position anticipating Western legal retaliation and ensuring awards would be worthless paper regardless of what tribunals decided. Media criticism is irrelevant to governments prioritizing citizen welfare over Western approval. Western media published countless articles criticizing our nationalizations, Russian partnerships, and ECOWAS withdrawal as economically destructive and politically illegitimate. Yet our citizens observed economy growing, security improving, and sovereignty strengthening, recognizing Western media served Western interests through propaganda rather than objective journalism. Western criticism lost all credibility as empirical reality contradicted every negative prediction Western media amplified. NGO lobbying loses effectiveness when citizens benefit from resource sovereignty, delivering visible improvements in government services, infrastructure, and economic opportunities. Western-funded NGOs lobbied against our mining nationalizations, claiming they would harm Burkinabe workers, reduce government revenues, and discourage future investment. Yet Burkinabe workers saw employment increase at SOPAMIB operations, prioritizing local hiring. Burkinabe citizens observed government revenues increase funding schools, hospitals, and roads. Burkinabe businesses recognized new opportunities as mining profits invested domestically rather than exported to foreign shareholders. NGO propaganda contradicted lived experience, making Western lobbying campaigns ineffective. Western lending restrictions matter less when Chinese financing provides alternatives without policy conditionality. World Bank and IMF threatened to withhold lending if we proceeded with nationalizations and rejected structural adjustment policies. We proceeded anyway and obtained Chinese financing for infrastructure projects that World Bank would have required years of feasibility studies and policy reforms to approve. Chinese financing arrived quickly, funded productive investments, and came without governance conditions, proving Western lending was never necessary if alternative sources existed respecting sovereignty. Every tool Western institutions possess to maintain control over African development proves inadequate against countries committed to sovereignty. The leverage Western donors previously exercised through aid dependence disappeared when domestic resource mobilization generated revenues exceeding aid. The investor confidence Western corporations claimed to provide became irrelevant when state-owned enterprises operated as efficiently or more efficiently. The market access Western trade preferences supposedly granted lost value when alternative trade partners offered comparable opportunities. The policy expertise Western institutions claimed to provide proved worthless when empirical results contradicted Western recommendations. Western development model's foundation crumbled because every mechanism maintaining African subordination failed when challenged by countries prioritizing sovereignty. The permanent transformation of African development is irreversible because knowledge cannot be unlearned. African governments cannot forget that Burkina Faso grew 5.5% implementing policies Western institutions warned would cause collapse. African citizens cannot ignore that countries following Western prescriptions achieved mediocre results while those prioritizing sovereignty prospered. African economists cannot deny that empirical evidence contradicts Western development theory. African policymakers cannot pretend Western aid, investment, and advice served African interests when alternatives clearly work better. The proof exists, the lessons are learned, and African development is transforming permanently regardless of Western efforts to preserve influence. The spread of sovereignty-focused development model across Africa represents permanent shift in continental development paradigm that no Western intervention can reverse. Too many countries observed Burkina Faso's success. Too many governments recognized Western models' failures. Too many citizens experienced benefits of resource sovereignty. Too many economists documented superior results of alternative approaches. Too many policymakers learned Western advice served Western interests rather than African prosperity. The knowledge is widespread, the evidence is conclusive, and the transformation is irreversible. Western development model's death is permanent. African sovereignty-focused development begins now across entire continent following precedent. Burkina Faso established proving alternatives work better than subordination ever did. Burkina Faso achieved 5.5% economic growth in 2025 while implementing every policy Western institutions warned would cause collapse. We expelled French forces, yet security improved, enabling economic activity. We nationalized Western mining corporations, yet production increased and revenues soared. We withdrew from ECOWAS, yet trade continued and even expanded through alternative partnerships. We rejected Western aid conditionality, yet mobilized domestic resources financing development priorities. We built partnerships with Russia and China, yet achieved growth exceeding countries maintaining exclusive Western relationships. Every Western prediction proved false. Every Western policy recommendation proved counterproductive. Every Western development theory proved wrong. The systematic failure of Western predictions demonstrates their development model never served African prosperity. Western institutions designed development approaches serving Western interests through African dependence, resource extraction, and policy subordination. They disguised extraction as assistance through aid rhetoric, investment promises, and partnership language. They insisted their approaches represented only path to prosperity, while alternatives would necessarily fail. Burkina Faso proved all those claims false by achieving superior results through sovereignty-focused policies, prioritizing national interests over Western preferences. Other African countries are learning lessons from Burkina Faso's success and implementing similar sovereignty-focused policies. Mali nationalized mines and built Russian security partnerships, achieving growth comparable to Burkina Faso. Niger expelled Western forces and increased resource taxation, maintaining economic stability despite Western sanctions. Multiple additional countries are reconsidering Western development relationships after observing that alternatives deliver better results. The transformation is spreading continent-wide as African governments recognize sovereignty serves prosperity better than subordination to Western interests. Western institutions cannot prevent that transformation because every tool they possess to maintain control proved ineffective. Aid cuts mean nothing when domestic resource mobilization works. Sanctions fail when alternative partnerships exist. Predictions of collapse lose credibility when proved wrong repeatedly. Policy conditionality becomes irrelevant when countries reject it and prosper anyway. Western development model's death is permanent because African countries learned it never served their interests and alternatives work demonstrably better. The comprehensive failure of every Western control mechanism represents unprecedented collapse of institutional power that dominated African development for over 60 years since independence. Western donors spent decades building elaborate systems to maintain influence over African policies through aid dependence, investment leverage, trade preferences, security partnerships, and ideological hegemony over development theory. Those systems appeared unassailable because they operated through seemingly voluntary relationships where African countries chose to accept Western terms rather than facing overt coercion. The voluntariness was always illusion because Western institutions structured choices, so accepting subordination appeared as only viable option, but that illusion is permanently shattered as African countries recognize genuine alternatives exist, delivering superior results. Aid cuts as punishment mechanism lost all effectiveness when Burkina Faso demonstrated domestic resource mobilization generates revenues exceeding any aid Western donors might threaten to withdraw. France announced suspension of development aid to Burkina Faso in 2023 after we expelled French forces and terminated defense agreements. European Union reduced aid commitments in response to military government and human rights concerns Western officials raised. United States cut security assistance citing democratic backsliding. Those aid reductions totaled hundreds of millions of dollars annually that Western donors assumed would force us to reverse policies they opposed or face fiscal crisis requiring their assistance on their terms. Yet we experienced no fiscal crisis whatsoever because revenues from nationalized gold mines, increased mining taxation, and improved domestic revenue collection exceeded all aid cuts combined. Our government budget actually strengthened as mining revenues flowed to Treasury rather than foreign shareholders, while aid-related costs disappeared, including expensive expatriate consultants, monitoring systems, and administrative overhead that Western aid required. We discovered aid had been net negative for fiscal position once all associated costs were properly accounted, making aid cuts beneficial rather than harmful for our public finances. That discovery is spreading across Africa as more countries calculate true costs of Western aid, including policy distortions, administrative burdens, and sovereignty compromises required to receive funding that often benefited donors more than recipients. Sanctions as coercion mechanism failed completely when alternative trade and financial partnerships eliminated Western leverage over African international commerce. ECOWAS imposed sanctions on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, attempting to pressure military governments to restore civilian rule according to Western democratic models. Those ECOWAS sanctions included trade restrictions, financial system disconnections, and diplomatic isolation that were supposed to cripple our economies, forcing capitulation to Western demands transmitted through ECOWAS institutions. Nigeria and France dominated. Sanctions failed entirely because we redirected trade to alternative partners, used alternative payment systems, and built alternative regional integration framework through AES, replacing ECOWAS functions that sanctions supposedly denied us. Chinese trade absorbed exports that ECOWAS sanctions attempted to block. Russian buyers purchased agricultural products and manufactured goods. Turkish markets opened for commodities that previously flowed through ECOWAS channels. Every trade relationship Western institutions assumed they controlled through ECOWAS proved replaceable through partnerships with powers that refused to participate in Western sanctions regimes. The multipolarity of global economy in 2020 meant Western sanctions lost coercive power they possessed during Cold War when Soviet collapse left African countries with no alternative to Western-dominated international systems. China, Russia, India, Turkey, Iran, and Gulf states provided complete alternatives to Western trade, finance, and investment, rendering Western sanctions ineffective regardless of how comprehensive Western coordination of punishment mechanisms might be. Financial sanctions proved equally impotent against countries that diversified away from dollar-denominated transactions and Western banking systems. Western financial institutions threatened to disconnect Burkina Faso from SWIFT international payment system, supposedly making international commerce impossible. We responded by conducting trade settlements through Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, that operated independently of Western financial networks. We used Russian financial messaging systems for transactions with Russian partners. We employed Turkish banking channels for Middle Eastern trade. We utilized cryptocurrency for certain international payments requiring no traditional banking infrastructure. Every Western financial sanction mechanism proved bypassable through alternative systems that expanded rapidly as Western weaponization of finance incentivized development of non-Western alternatives. The loss of sanctions effectiveness represents permanent transformation of international power dynamics that no Western policy can reverse. Multipolarity is structural feature of contemporary global economy rather than temporary condition that Western primacy might restore through better strategy. China's economy rivals or exceeds America's depending on measurement methodology. India's growth trajectory positions it as future economic superpower. Russia maintains substantial natural resources and military capabilities. Gulf states possess enormous financial resources from energy exports. Turkey occupies strategic geographic position controlling access between Europe and Asia. Dozens of middle powers possess sufficient scale to provide meaningful alternatives to Western partnerships. That structural multipolarity means African countries possess genuine choices rather than facing false options where only pathway involved accepting Western subordination. Western predictions of collapse lost all credibility after being proven false repeatedly across multiple African countries implementing sovereignty-focused policies. Western institutions predicted Burkina Faso would experience economic catastrophe after expelling French forces, yet our growth accelerated. They forecasted Mali would collapse after nationalizing mining assets, yet Mali's economy remained stable. They warned Niger would suffer isolation after closing American bases, yet Niger maintained international commerce. Every prediction failed because they assumed African prosperity required Western approval when reality was African development accelerated after rejecting Western subordination. The systematic failure of Western predictions destroyed institutional credibility that development expertise supposedly justified Western authority over African policies. Listen carefully to why prediction failures matter beyond simple forecasting errors. Western development models' legitimacy depended on claim that Western institutions possessed superior knowledge about economic growth, enabling them to advise African countries toward prosperity. That claimed expertise justified policy conditionality requiring African governments to implement Western recommendations in exchange for aid and investment. Repeated prediction failures exposed Western expertise as ideology serving Western interests rather than objective knowledge serving African development. Once expertise credibility collapsed, policy conditionality lost any legitimate justification, becoming revealed as pure power exercise extracting African subordination in exchange for resources African countries could obtain elsewhere without conditions. Policy conditionality as control mechanism became completely irrelevant when countries rejected conditions, prospered anyway, and demonstrated Western prescriptions were counterproductive rather than beneficial. IMF structural adjustment programs required African countries to privatize state enterprises, liberalize trade, deregulate financial sectors, and reduce government spending in exchange for lending and debt relief. Those conditions served Western corporate interests by opening African markets to foreign investment, eliminating trade protections for African industries, and reducing government capacity to regulate foreign corporate behavior. Western economists claimed structural adjustment would generate growth by improving economic efficiency and attracting foreign investment. Burkina Faso proved opposite, rejecting structural adjustment, expanding state ownership, increasing trade regulation, and growing faster than countries that implemented IMF prescriptions faithfully. The empirical evidence against structural adjustment is overwhelming and conclusive. Countries that implemented IMF programs most faithfully, including Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda during 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, experienced modest growth at best and often stagnant or declining per capita incomes. Countries that rejected structural adjustment or implemented it only partially while maintaining state-led development strategies including Ethiopia, Rwanda, and now Burkina Faso achieved substantially higher growth rates and poverty reduction. The correlation is clear. Structural adjustment harmed African development while state-led sovereignty-focused policies delivered prosperity. Western economists cannot explain that evidence without admitting their recommendations served Western interests rather than African development, so they ignore evidence and continue recommending same failed policies. The death of Western development model is permanent because the knowledge African countries gained about its true purposes cannot be erased or forgotten. African governments learned through direct experience that Western aid created dependency rather than enabling development. They observed that Western investment extracted resources rather than building prosperity. They discovered that Western security partnerships worsened situations rather than protecting stability. They recognized that Western policy advice served Western corporate interests rather than African welfare. They realized that alternatives existed delivering superior results without subordination. That knowledge is experiential rather than theoretical, making it impossible for Western propaganda to reverse, regardless of how many reports Western institutions publish, claiming their model works despite all evidence showing it fails. The specific lessons African countries learned from Burkina Faso's success will reshape continental development for generations. First lesson is that domestic resource mobilization through taxation and state ownership of strategic sectors generates sustainable revenues exceeding aid flows while building state capacity and government accountability. Second lesson is that resource sovereignty through nationalization or increased taxation captures wealth for national development rather than allowing foreign extraction. Third lesson is that alternative partnerships with non-Western powers provide financing, investment, and technology without political conditionality, subordinating sovereignty. Fourth lesson is that state-led development prioritizing strategic sectors through industrial policy and selective protection delivers growth and employment better than neoliberal policies Western institutions recommended. Fifth lesson is that regional integration among countries with aligned sovereignty interests works more effectively than Western-designed frameworks serving external influence. Listen carefully one final time. World Bank and IMF. Burkina Faso just grew 5.5%, proving your predictions of collapse were completely wrong. We implemented sovereignty-focused policies you opposed and achieved superior results compared to countries following your prescriptions. We built alternative partnerships you warned against and prospered more than countries accepting your aid with conditionality. We prioritized national interests over your approval and demonstrated your development model served your interests rather than ours. Your credibility is destroyed permanently. Your influence over African development is ending, and African prosperity begins now with countries controlling their own resources, implementing their own policies, and building their own partnerships independent of your failed advice. Your era of extracting African wealth through development rhetoric finished. Our era of genuine African development serving African interests begins. The finality of Western development model's death cannot be overstated. This is not temporary setback that better Western strategy might overcome. This is not misunderstanding that better communication might resolve. This is not policy disagreement that compromise might bridge. This is fundamental recognition by African countries that Western development model was always designed to serve Western interests through African subordination disguised as assistance. That recognition is permanent because it is based on empirical evidence that Western institutions cannot dispute. Burkina Faso grew 5.5%, implementing policies Western institutions opposed. Mali maintained stability after nationalizations Western institutions warned against. Niger prospered despite sanctions Western institutions imposed. The evidence is conclusive and cannot be explained away by Western excuses about governance, corruption, or implementation failures. The transformation spreading across Africa is irreversible because too many countries observed the evidence, too many citizens experienced the benefits, too many economists documented the results, and too many policymakers learned the lessons. Mali followed Burkina Faso's nationalization precedent and achieved similar revenue increases. Niger implemented resource sovereignty policies and maintained economic stability. Guinea renegotiated mining contracts and increased government revenues substantially. Tanzania, Zambia, and Democratic Republic of Congo raised mining taxation, capturing larger shares of resource wealth. Multiple countries across continent implemented policies proving sovereignty-focused development works better than Western prescriptions. Each success reinforces lessons other countries learned, making transformation self-sustaining rather than dependent on continued demonstration by early adopters. The permanent end of Western control over African development represents liberation from neo-colonial extraction system that operated for over 60 years through development rhetoric, disguising wealth transfer from Africa to West. That system is dead. Its death is permanent. Its replacement is sovereignty-focused development model, prioritizing African prosperity over Western convenience. And that replacement is spreading continent-wide as African countries learn from Burkina Faso's success, proving alternatives work better than subordination ever did. Your era finished, World Bank and IMF. Our era begins now, and nothing you do will restore control you permanently lost when African countries recognized your model served your interests rather than ours. African development belongs to Africans now. Your extraction scheme is over forever.